You know what nobody tells you about building wealth? The hardest part isn't getting rich, it's getting started. I'm serious. Ask anyone who's built real wealth and they'll tell you the same thing. Getting from zero to $5,000 is genuinely harder than going from 5,000 to 50,000. And I know that sounds completely backwards, like mathematically 50,000 is 10 times more than 5,000. How could the smaller number possibly be harder to reach? But here's what I've learned after spending way too much time studying how money actually works. The first 5,000 isn't just about the money, it's about everything you have to become to save that money. And that transformation is the hardest part of the entire wealth building journey. Let me paint you a picture. Right now, according to research from Empower, the median emergency savings for Americans is just $500. Not 5,000, 500. And about 32% of Americans don't have any emergency savings at all. The Federal Reserve found that roughly 37% of people couldn't cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing money or selling something. So when I say your first 5,000 is hard, I'm not exaggerating. Most people never get there. They spend their entire lives bouncing between zero and a few $100, never building that foundation that actually lets wealth grow. But why? Why is this first milestone so brutally difficult? It comes down to three things that nobody wants to talk about. First, you're fighting against your own brain. Second, you have zero momentum working in your favor. And third, every single dollar you save has to come directly from your own effort. There's no compounding, there's no passive income, there's no money making money. It's just you grinding against the current. Let's start with the brain thing, because this is where most people get stuck without even realizing it. Psychologists have a term called temporal discounting. Basically, your brain is wired to prefer rewards right now over rewards later. And not just a little bit. Your brain massively undervalues future benefits compared to immediate ones. So when you're trying to save money, you're literally fighting against millions of years of evolution that's screaming at you to spend it now while you can. Here's what makes this even worse. When you're starting from zero, saving feels pointless. You put away $50 and your brain goes, "Great, now we have $50 that we can't spend. What exactly did we accomplish here?" There's no visible progress, no compound interest kicking in, no sense of momentum, just sacrifice without any obvious reward. Research from behavioral finance shows that people who don't have savings often experience what's called financial avoidance. They literally stop checking their bank accounts because the anxiety is too overwhelming. A study published in Frontiers in Behavioral Economics found that many savings plans fail before any deposit is even made because people can't get past this initial psychological barrier. Now, compare this to someone who already has $50,000 saved. When they add another $5,000, their portfolio doesn't just grow by $5,000. It grows by the $5,000 plus whatever returns their existing money generates. If they're invested in something like an S&P 500 index fund, which has historically returned around 8 to 10% annually, their $50,000 is already generating $4,000 to $5,000 in growth on its own. So while you're grinding to save your first $5,000 entirely through your own sacrifice, they're essentially getting the same amount handed to them by their existing money. Same outcome, completely different effort required. This is what Charlie Munger was talking about when he said the first 100,000 is the hardest. The same principle applies at every level. Getting started is always the steepest climb. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is the part that actually gives me hope for anyone watching this who's currently at zero or close to it. The difficulty of that first 5,000 isn't a bug in the system, it's actually a feature. Because when you finally push through and reach that milestone, you've done something that most people never accomplish. You've proven to yourself that you can delay gratification when it matters. You've built the psychological muscle that makes everything else possible. The reason going from 5,000 to 50,000 becomes easier isn't just because of compound interest, although that definitely helps. It's because you've already become the type of person who saves money. You've already fought through the hardest psychological battles. You've already developed the habits and the identity of someone who builds wealth instead of just consuming it. All right, let's talk numbers, because once you understand the math behind this, you'll never look at your savings the same way again. Let's say you're saving $500 a month. That's pretty aggressive for most people, but let's use it as an example. At that rate, getting to your first $5,000 takes 10 months. 10 months of discipline, 10 months of saying no to things you want, 10 months of watching your friends spend freely while you're putting money into an account that's barely growing. And during those 10 months, assuming you're keeping that money in a high-yield savings account earning around 4 to 5%, you're earning maybe $200 in interest total. That's it. $200 for 10 months of effort. Your returns feel almost insulting. But watch what happens when you already have $5,000 saved and you're going for $50,000. Now you're starting with a base that's actually generating meaningful returns. That $5,000 is earning around $200 to $250 per year on its own. Not life-changing, but it's a start. More importantly, every additional dollar you save now has momentum behind it. As your balance grows, the returns accelerate. By the time you hit $20,000, you're generating roughly $1,000 per year in passive growth. At $30,000, it's closer to $1,500. And once you cross $40,000, you're adding almost $2,000 annually without lifting a finger. Here's where the real magic happens. If you invested that same $500 per month in a diversified portfolio, earning the historical S&P 500 average of around 10%, the compounding effect becomes dramatically more powerful. Your first $5,000 still takes those brutal 10 months of pure savings, but your second $5,000, that takes a little less time because your first $5,000 is now working alongside your contributions. Your third $5,000 takes even less, and by the time you're approaching $50,000, you're generating several $1,000s per year in returns alone. This is what people mean when they say wealth builds on itself. It's not some mystical concept, it's just math. Each dollar you accumulate recruits new dollars to help you accumulate more. But you have to get to that first meaningful pile before the recruitment can begin. The Federal Reserve's survey of consumer finances shows that the median American household has around $8,000 in savings. That's the median, meaning half of all households have less than that. But here's what's interesting. Once people cross that initial threshold and actually build a foundation, they tend to keep building. It's like there's a gravitational pull in two directions. Below a certain point, money tends to slip away. Above that point, money tends to accumulate. And the first $5,000 is roughly where that gravitational shift happens for most people. Now, I want to be really clear about something. I'm not saying that getting to $50,000 is easy. It still requires discipline and consistent effort over years. What I'm saying is that the difficulty per dollar changes dramatically as you progress. Those first $5,000 might cost you 10 months of intense focus, constant temptation, and zero visible reward from compounding. The next $45,000, while it takes longer in absolute time, feels progressively easier because you've got allies helping you along the way. Think about it like pushing a car. Getting it moving from a dead stop requires massive effort. You're straining, maybe you need a few people to help, and it barely budges at first. But once you get those wheels turning, maintaining momentum becomes dramatically easier. Adding speed becomes possible with less relative effort. Your first $5,000 is pushing that car from a dead stop. Your next $45,000 is accelerating a car that's already rolling. But there's another factor here that I think is even more important than the math, and it has to do with what saving that first $5,000 actually does to your psychology. When you have nothing saved, every financial decision comes from a place of scarcity. Your boss is a jerk? You can't quit because you need the paycheck. An opportunity comes along that requires a small investment? You can't take it because you don't have the capital. Your car breaks down? That's not an inconvenience, that's a crisis that could derail your entire month. But something shifts when you have even a few thousand in the bank. Suddenly, you're not making decisions from desperation anymore. You have options. You have breathing room. You can actually think strategically instead of just surviving. Here's what nobody talks about when it comes to building wealth. It's not really about the money, at least not at first. When you save your first $5,000, you're not just accumulating currency, you're becoming a different person. You're proving to yourself that you have the discipline to delay gratification, the focus to maintain a goal over months, and the self-control to say no when everything around you is screaming yes. And that identity shift is worth way more than $5,000. I think about it like this. Anyone can get lucky and come into some money. Inheritance, lottery, whatever. But statistically, people who receive windfalls they didn't earn tend to lose that money pretty quickly. Studies consistently show that most lottery winners end up back where they started within a few years, sometimes worse off. Why? Because they never developed the identity of someone who builds and maintains wealth. They got the money without going through the transformation. But when you grind out your first $5,000 through discipline and sacrifice, you've installed something in your brain that can't be taken away. You've become the type of person who can build wealth. And once you have that identity, the second $5,000 comes more naturally. The third, even more so, because you're not fighting against yourself anymore. You're just being who you've become. Research into financial behavior supports this. A study on financial well-being found that self-control is one of the most significant determinants of both financial behavior and financial well-being. People with higher self-control make wiser financial decisions and experience better outcomes across the board. But here's the thing about self-control. It's not something you just have or don't have. It's something you build through practice. And saving your first $5,000 is one of the most effective ways to build it. Every time you see something you want to buy but choose to save instead, you're strengthening that muscle. Every time you check your growing balance instead of avoiding your finances, you're rewiring your relationship with money. Every time you resist the urge to spend just because everyone around you is spending, you're becoming someone different. By the time you hit $5,000, you've done this hundreds of times. You've made the hard choice over and over, and at some point, it stops being a hard choice. It just becomes what you do. This is why the jump from $5,000 to $50,000 feels easier even beyond the mathematical advantages. You've already done the psychological heavy lifting. You've already proven you can do this. Now it's just about repeating what you've already shown yourself you can do, but with compound interest helping you along. Let me give you a practical example of how this plays out. Say you're someone who's never had more than a few $100s saved. Every unexpected expense throws you into crisis mode. You might have debt from past emergencies that you're still paying off. The idea of saving feels almost laughable because there's always something more urgent demanding your money. This is the reality for a huge percentage of people. According to the Federal Reserve, about 30% of adults couldn't cover 3 months of expenses by any means. That's nearly 1 in 3 Americans living without any real financial buffer. Now imagine you somehow push through and build that first $5,000. What changes? First, your stress level drops dramatically. Research from Vanguard suggests that having even $2,000 in emergency savings increases financial well-being significantly. At $5,000, you've probably covered 1 to 2 months of basic expenses depending on where you live. That's enough to handle most emergencies without going into debt. Second, you stop making decisions from desperation. That terrible job with the awful boss, you now have options you didn't have before. Not unlimited options, but enough to negotiate from a position of some strength rather than pure survival. Third, you start seeing opportunities instead of just threats. When you're at zero, every financial situation is potentially dangerous. When you've got a cushion, you can actually evaluate opportunities on their merits. And fourth, your money finally starts working for you. $5,000 in a decent investment account is generating real returns. Not huge amounts, but visible amounts. Amounts that make you want to add more so you can generate even more returns. This is the flywheel starting to spin. Each element reinforces the others. Less stress means better decisions. Better decisions mean more savings. More savings mean more returns. More returns mean faster growth. Faster growth means even less stress. Look, I'm not going to pretend that saving your first $5,000 is easy. It's genuinely hard. probably the hardest financial thing you'll ever do. But that's exactly why it matters so much, because on the other side of that difficulty is an entirely different relationship with money, one where you're in control instead of constantly reacting, one where opportunities start appearing because you're finally in a position to take them, one where your money works alongside you instead of constantly disappearing. That first $5,000 isn't just $5,000. It's the foundation everything else gets built on. Start today, not tomorrow, not when things calm down, not when you get that raise. Today. Open a high-yield savings account, set up an automatic transfer for whatever you can manage, and begin the process. The amounts almost don't matter at first. What matters is starting the transformation, because the person you become by saving that first $5,000 is worth way more than the money itself. And once you become that person, everything else gets easier. Trust me, your future self is counting on the decision you make right now.